Thank you for joining us as we explore one of the most unsettling instances in American history. Today, we explore the shadows of the Smoky Mountains, where two little boys vanished into thin air during the chilly fall of 1861. Leave a comment from where you are, and be ready for a tale that has been told for generations with no resolution. The Great Smoky Mountains, which got their name from the constant fog that shrouds them, stand between North Carolina and Tennessee like silent sentries. In those days, these mountains were home to resilient pioneers, small, remote towns, and bold travelers who risked perilous paths in quest of fresh chances prior to the Civil War's transformation of the country. Families were forced to take sides during a period of increasing national tension in 1861, and mistrust pervaded every interaction on the sandy highways. In late October, brothers Thomas and William Brennan left their estate in Sevier County, Tennessee, for a trip that was only expected to take 3 days. Thomas, who was 23 years old, had light eyes and brown hair that he received from his Irish mother. William, who was 2 years younger, gained the trust of strangers with his easy smile and sturdy build. On the rocky slopes that defined the mountainous area, they both worked on the family's little farm, raising pigs and growing corn. The journey had a straightforward and essential goal. They had to prepare for the impending winter in Gatlinburg, a little hamlet next to the Little River, by gathering farm equipment and supplies. River Pigeon. Even though the trip was only 30 miles long, the meandering paths through the highlands made every trip unexpected. The brothers loaded their wagon hauled by 2 mixed-breed horses on Monday morning, October 28th, bid farewell to their younger brother and bereaved mother, and made a commitment to return by Wednesday nightfall. Mrs. Martha Brennan watched as her kids vanished down the misty morning trail. She had no idea that this would be the final time she would see them. Beyond the typical anxiety of a mother sending her children into the perilous mountains by themselves, there was nothing out of the ordinary about that morning. No foreboding sign. At that time of year, when autumn turns the forests into a mosaic of orange and gold hues before the severe winter covers everything in unrelenting snow, the sky was heavy with low clouds. There was no news for the first several days, which didn't raise any red flags right away. Back then, communications relied solely on messengers and random roadside meetings. Families may be unaware of loved ones' travels for weeks at a time. However, the Brennan household started to feel uneasy when Saturday, November 1st, rolled around and the brothers were still absent. Samuel, the 16-year-old youngest brother, mounted the lone surviving horse and traveled in the same direction toward Gatlinburg in the hopes of finding Thomas and William, who were either delayed by a mechanical issue with the wagon or possibly enjoying the hospitality of friends in the community. The family was sent into an abyss of fear and confusion by what Samuel found in Gatlinburg. The brothers arrived in town at around noon on Tuesday, October 29th, according to local businesses. They used silver coins to pay for tools, sacks of grain, salt, gunpowder, and other items. According to witnesses, the two appeared to be in a good mood, had a brief conversation regarding the escalating political tensions, and departed town at 3 p.m., returning to Sevier County via the main trail. No one had seen them since. With heartbreaking news, Samuel came home. The boys had vanished somewhere along the trail that went through some of the most remote and heavily forested parts of the Smoky Mountains, between Gatlinburg and the family farm. The family promptly gathered a group of local acquaintances and neighbors to conduct a search. Men used to the highlands and their inherent dangers. For 5 days in a row, they examined known tunnels, looked into ravines, searched every turn on the trail, and questioned every inhabitant of the few remote cabins scattered around this environment. Nothing at all was found during the search. There was no sign of the brothers, the horses, the wagon, or the recently acquired tools. It seemed as though William Brennan and Thomas had just disappeared into the mists that surrounded those mountains. The case was made even more unsettling by the lack of any trace. There should have been wreckage, wheel tracks leaving the trail, and other signs of disaster even if they had been in a tragic accident. However, the quiet of. The mountains were impenetrable and absolute. In the second week of November, the investigation was formally taken over by 50-year-old Jacob Morrison, the Sevier County Sheriff. Morrison was known for his effectiveness and had resolved many local cases. However, he was initially confused by this scenario. He coordinated an even more thorough search with seasoned trackers who were familiar with all the back trails and hidden roads in the Smoky Mountains. He asked folks who had traveled through the area back then, offered a reward for information while visiting bars and other locations along the trade routes, but to no success. Articles concerning the enigmatic disappearance started to appear in local media. In its November 15, 1861, issue, the Knoxville Register, the top newspaper in eastern Tennessee, dedicated half a page to the case, detailing the Brennan brothers and urging anyone with information to get in touch with Sevier County officials. The article conjectured about potential causes, ranging from natural disasters to encounters with wild creatures, but refrained from discussing the potential that something much darker had happened on that foggy trail, a prospect that was starting to plague the neighborhood. During that time, the Smoky Mountains were a place of stark contrasts. The darker aspects of frontier civilization coexisted with religious communities and working-class families. The remote highlands were a haven for guys who had given up on their life elsewhere, fugitives and deserters. Reports of highway robberies were sporadic. The total lack of evidence in the Brennan brothers' case did not follow the usual pattern of banditry, even though they seldom led to deadly violence. After stealing the items, the thieves most likely abandoned the wagon, let the horses roam, or sold the animals in far-off places. None of these events had occurred. The prospect of discovering Thomas and William alive dwindled like morning mist under the sun as November progressed and the first snows covered the Smoky Mountains' highest peaks. The Brennan household became embroiled in a unusual sorrow is the type of unfulfilled grief that develops when there is no body to bury and no assurance that the cycle of loss will end. With every day that went by, Martha Brennan grew older. Her eyes were locked on the route, her gray hair growing whiter every dawn, as though she might summon her sons from the shadows with the power of her will. Sheriff Morrison's probe was not limited to Sevier County. He wrote in-depth letters to the authorities in nearby Tennessee and North Carolina counties, portraying the horses, the wagon, and the brothers in great detail. Each letter contained the precise day of their disappearance, October 29th in the afternoon, and asked bar owners, blacksmiths, and cattle dealers to keep an eye out for any attempts to sell items that fit the descriptions. December saw the start of the responses, all of which were negative and lacked any encouraging leads. During Morrison's discussions with locals along the trail, an interesting tidbit surfaced. Elijah, a farmer. On the afternoon of October 29th, Cooper, whose property was located about midway between Gatlinburg and the Brennan farm, claimed to have heard weird noises. Around 5 o'clock, the light began to fade and the shadows between the tall trees grew longer. Cooper described the sounds as coming from the direction of the main trail and sounding like muffled screams, probably human. He had thought about going in, but it was a long way, and nightfall in the mountains had its own risks. He concluded that they were most likely just. A bear or other wild animal frightening travelers is a frequent occurrence in the area. This testimony gave the case a sinister new dimension. Something horrible had occurred on that specific section of route if the screams Cooper had heard actually belonged to the Brennan boys. Morrison conducted a focused search of that region. but no relevant evidence could be found due to the weeks that had elapsed during the November rains. There was no trace of a scuffle on the wet ground. The thick undergrowth revealed no indications of commotion, and the path was as quiet as an unmarked grave. In response to the disappearance, the local community started formulating its own theories. Speculation was rampant in Gatlinburg bars and at Sunday get-togethers following church services. Some speculated that the brothers had made the decision to escape west, giving up their precarious existence in the Tennessee highlands in pursuit of chances in regions beyond of the Mississippi. Those who knew Thomas and William, however, found this theory to be incomprehensible. They were the fact that these respectable young men, who were very close to their younger brother and widowed mother, abruptly left the family in despair, went against everything their neighbors knew about them. Some talked about cavemen, people who were said to reside in the uncharted regions of the Smoky Mountains and periodically emerged to prey on gullible tourists. These tales combined authentic fear of the unknown with legend. There were several caverns in the highlands, some of which were mapped and known, while others have not yet been found. These caverns could have been used as hiding places by small groups of deserters or fugitives living on the periphery of organized society. However, once more, the total lack of traces made this explanation hard to believe. Bandits even left behind traces. Only in private discussions, a more unsettling theory started to surface. There were many who thought the brothers had seen something inappropriate. Maybe a covert meeting or an illicit activity, connected to the escalating political unrest that would precede the American Civil War. Confederate supporters and Unionists had competing allegiances in Tennessee. Clandestine gatherings were occurring in remote places that fall of 1861, months after hostilities had broken out in other states. Is it possible that Thomas and William happened upon one of these meetings by chance and were eliminated in order to maintain silence? Morrison cautiously looked into this idea, understanding that direct inquiries concerning covert political operations could endanger his own life. He had casual conversations with prominent individuals from both sides of the political spectrum in the area, looking for signs of anxiety or secret information. His efforts simply reaffirmed what he already knew. They did not yield any meaningful results. At that time, the Smoky Mountains were a place of many secrets, where everyone had information they would rather not share. In December, winter came in full force, covering the mountains with a thick layer of snow. That prevented any more searching till April. Morrison continued to receive and reply to correspondence, pursuing every tenuous lead that came his way, but the inquiry was driven into hibernation. In Asheville, North Carolina, a horse dealer claimed to have seen horses that fit the Brennan family's description. However, Martha Brennan found little comfort when Morrison visited the area in January 1862 and learned that the horses had been owned by a local rancher for almost 3 years. She started experiencing unsettling dreams in which she saw her kids calling to her from the mountain's hazy depths. The cold wind distorted their voices. On snowy days, neighbors said they saw her strolling alone along the trail, a lone figure in black, looking for indications that would never come. Her sole surviving son, Samuel, assumed full responsibility for the property. But everything they achieved was clouded by the specter of loss. Newspapers stopped covering the case because the war took up all of the public's attention. Pay attention. The abduction of 2 young men in the Tennessee mountains was reduced to a small tragedy amid the national catastrophe, while bloody battles in other states dominated the news. The matter was last reported in the Knoxville Register in March 1862, with a brief comment indicating that the inquiry was still inconclusive. However, when the snow eventually melted and the trails were once again passable in the spring of that year, an unanticipated finding rekindled the investigation and brought up unsettling new issues. A hunter named. About 12 miles south of the main trail, in a secluded portion of the highlands, Benjamin Walsh discovered the wreckage of a wagon partially concealed by fallen branches and thick foliage. Although the wood was damaged from exposure, many features were consistent with the Brennan brothers' wagon description. The nature of the search was entirely changed by Benjamin Walsh's finding. While hunting a wounded deer that had taken him into a deep valley far from any known sources, the hunter had discovered the debris. Trail. The wagon was on its side, with leaves and branches that had accumulated throughout the winter covering part of it. Walsh saw right once that this was not an accident. In an effort to make the debris unnoticeable, someone had purposefully covered it with grass. 2 days later, Sheriff Morrison showed up on the location with 3 seasoned trackers and Samuel Brennan. From the main route, the journey to the ravine took about 4 hours, across ice streams fed by springs and descending steep slopes. Melting water. Even by Smoky Mountain standards, the area was secluded, and few people would go there unless they had a specific cause. The selection of this hiding spot demonstrated thorough planning and in-depth familiarity with the area. They found the wagon was empty when they started inspecting it after removing the branches. None of the items Thomas and William had bought in Gatlinburg, including tools and flour sacks. The idea of a mechanical mishap was refuted by the fact that the wheels were undamaged. Axe marks were visible on the wood in several places, as though someone had begun disassembling it but given up midway. Through particular symbols his father had cut into the wood years earlier, Samuel was able to clearly identify the wagon. The rear axle has 3 parallel notches. Morrison and his men expanded their search in ever-widening circles as they carefully examined the terrain surrounding the ravine. They discovered a piece of horse harness, pieces of what appeared to be clothing, other items buried shallowly beneath leaves and dirt, and most, a tiny leather-bound Bible with the name Martha Brennan written on the first page was unsettling. Thomas always carried it with him. It was a present his mother had given him years earlier. The book was still identifiable despite being discolored and ruined by dampness. Morrison was profoundly perplexed by the horse's absence. Live animals could be traced and were valued. Unless the animals had been killed, which would have been the case, whomever had taken the Brennan horses would have eventually had to sell them, leaving a trail. An unexplainable waste, or transported well beyond the range of Morrison's communications. Samuel gave him detailed descriptions of the horses, which he then forwarded to officials in Kentucky, Virginia, and even the area beyond the Mississippi. After 3 full days of thorough searching, no remains were discovered in the ravine or in the surrounding area. This was a sinister mystery. Where were the bodies of Thomas and William if they had been killed there? Bears, wolves, and other predators were found in the Smoky Mountains. Might devour evidence for months, but typically left behind human remains, ripped clothing, and bones. The whole silence of the woodland regarding the brothers' situation became more sinister. Morrison started thinking about things that didn't seem possible at first. What if the brothers had been detained against their will and were still living somewhere? Although they were uncommon, kidnappings were not impossible, particularly during wartime when desperate people would do anything. William and Thomas might have been compelled to labor in some covert, unapproved whiskey production, illicit mining, or mountain operations. Although Morrison was aware that there was little likelihood of finding them alive after so many months, this theory gave Martha Brennan a ray of hope. Public interest in the case was rekindled after the wagon was found. In May 1862, a long piece summarizing the entire incident and describing the discoveries in the ravine was published in the Knoxville Register. The article was picked up by other newspapers in bigger towns like Nashville and even Richmond, Virginia. Taverns and saloons around the southern Appalachian Mountains were talking about the Brennan brothers' mystery for a few weeks. There were unanticipated repercussions from this public interest. Claiming to have knowledge on the case, people started to appear in Gatlinburg and Sevier County. The majority were opportunists who made up complex tales with no real foundation in order to obtain the reward Morrison had offered. However, one testimony from the charlatans stood out and merited careful consideration. Sarah Whitmore, a lady who lives in A, came to Morrison in June with a startling tale from a remote home in the foothills. Living alone since her husband's death from a fever years earlier, Sarah was in her early 40s. Only a few people knew the small trails that led to her cabin, which was in an isolated location. She clarified that although she had been silent up until that point due to fear, the finding of the wagon and the increased interest in the case made her feel compelled to speak up. She had saw 3 guys going close to her property in late October 1861, pulling a wagon. By 2 horses. This wouldn't have been extraordinary in and of itself, save for 3 particulars that she remembered well. First of all, the men were purposefully avoiding common travel routes by not following any recognized paths. Second, they paused for a moment beside a stream that was visible from their cabin, and Sarah could hear them debating passionately over something, but she couldn't hear what they were saying. Third, and perhaps most unsettling, she was positive that she had noticed dark patches on the wagon's rear, areas that, from the particular tint of something she didn't want to name, seemed to be distance. Morrison asked Sarah a lot of questions in an attempt to find discrepancies and gauge how consistently she remembered things. She steadfastly kept to her account, giving specifics about the 3 men's appearances that aligned with broad descriptions of those who are known to visit the Smoky Mountains' deeper regions. She claimed that one of them had a long-barreled gun and had a characteristic red beard. Another was stockier and shorter, donning a hat with a large black brim. The third was farther away, making it difficult for her to see his face. This insight created completely new avenues for research. In an area where many people lived semi-nomadically, and there were few official records, Morrison started looking for men who fit Sarah's descriptions. This was a difficult effort. He was aware that he had to be careful. If murderers were involved, going up against them head-on without concrete proof could be risky or cause them to destroy whatever. Remaining proof. The civil strife raged all around them while Morrison worked covertly after these fresh leads. With troops from both sides traversing the state, Tennessee had turned into an active battlefield. The inquiry experienced unanticipated repercussions as a result of this disruption. Many mountain men escaped or were drafted in order to avoid serving in the military. Others joined guerrilla groups that functioned outside of any official military structure and vanished into the forests. Criminal activity found the ideal cover in the chaos of war. The Smoky Mountains experienced oppressive heat in the summer of 1862, along with a tense atmosphere that appeared to contaminate the air itself. Sheriff Morrison was caught between the increasingly difficult duties of upholding law and order in a county divided by competing allegiances and his inquiry into the disappearance of the Brennan brothers. Confederate forces set up outposts in a number of villages in East Tennessee, confiscating supplies and questioning locals about their allegiance to the Union. In this unstable context, many people found queries about a crime that occurred a month ago to be nearly insignificant. However, Morrison was an obstinate individual, and Sarah Whitmore's testimony had strengthened his resolve. In order to create a mental list of possible suspects, he spent weeks compiling details on guys who fit Sarah's descriptions. I found the man with the red beard really fascinating. Numerous individuals brought up Rufus Crane, who was notorious for engaging in dubious activities in the mountains, such as smuggling untaxed, alcohol, as well as potential petty theft participation. Although he had never been officially charged with a severe offense, Crane had a reputation for using violence when provoked. At August, Morrison found Crane at a dilapidated bar close to Pigeon Forge, a tiny community a few miles from Gatlinburg. From the beginning, the confrontation was tense. Crane was a medium-height man with a muscular build and eyes that showed years of hard life in the mountains. Crane's demeanor shifted when Morrison brought up the disappearance of the Brennan brothers. The sheriff, who was trained in reading people, didn't miss the nearly undetectable rigidity. Crane denied knowing anything about the case. He stated that he was employed at a logging operation in Blount County in October 1861, which was a long way from the location of the Brennans' disappearance. He gave the names of others who were purportedly able to verify his alibi. Morrison was aware, however, that it would take weeks to verify such accusations and would require the cooperation of people who would probably lie to protect one of their own. With a smile that fell short of his eyes, Crane added that so many wagons traveled through the Smoky Mountains that it would be impossible for anyone to recall a particular one after so many months. Morrison was certain that Crane knew more than he was acknowledging when he left the meeting. However, even in times of war, the law requires more than suspicion and gut feeling to support an arrest. He made the decision to keep a close eye on Crane and his known connections, in the hopes that they would be betrayed by accident. However, as military demands depleted the county's resources, the policy grew more challenging to execute. Martha Brennan kept up her silent watch while Morrison labored in the background. In the months since her children had vanished, she had become remarkably older. Her face was marked with deep lines of anguish, and her hair was now entirely white. Neighbors provided assistance and food, but nothing could make up for Thomas and William's absence. Samuel tried his hardest to maintain the farm operating, but every chore was more difficult without two pairs of powerful arms. A severe storm that brought 3 days of non-stop rain to the Smoky Mountains occurred in September. Trails became rivers of mud, streams became violent torrents, and flash floods ruined a number of cabins in the lower regions. A macabre was discovered on the banks of a stream about 8 miles west of the location where the wagon had been discovered months earlier when the waters eventually subsided. A 12-year-old boy, who was the local. A farmer saw something lodged between the roots of a downed tree on the stream bank as he was fishing. When he looked more closely, he saw that it was a man's leather footwear that was surprisingly well preserved, despite being partially buried in the mud. The discovery was especially unsettling because a human foot was still within the boot, its bones clearly human despite being scavenged by time and water. Morrison was alerted right away and showed up before dusk. The footwear was similar to the one typically worn by rural personnel in the area that are hard to pinpoint. The foot bones were meticulously gathered and inspected. Dr. Henry Blackwood, a local doctor, concluded that they belonged to a male young adult, most likely in his 20s or 30s. This was not conclusive evidence of identity, but it was consistent with either Thomas or William Brennan. After the boot was found, Morrison planned a thorough search upstream and downstream in the creek. Other bones could be strewn if human remains were moved by the floodwaters, all throughout the region. Men searched the banks for 5 days, looking over every twig and piece of debris that the retreating floods had left behind. Over the course of almost half a mile along the creek, they discovered more pieces of human bone, all in a highly decomposed form. After analyzing every found bone, Dr. Blackwood came to the conclusion that at least one person, possibly two, owned them. While it was challenging to be completely certain due to the bone's dispersion and state, the doctor clarified that soft tissue would have long since vanished, and that fatal damage to important organs would not leave evidence on the bones, even though there were no evident symptoms of trauma to the bones, gunshot marks, or fractures indicating direct aggression. From the skeletal bones alone, The cause of death could not be ascertained. The boot was to be examined by Samuel Brennan. In the hazy afternoon light, he turned it from all sides while holding it in quivering hands. There was a noticeable spot on the... He had fixed one of William's boots months prior, inside the heel. Samuel verified that the boot had been his brother's, tears running silently down his cheeks. The Brennan family was ultimately faced with a grim certainty. They had lost at least one of their children, and very likely both. There was silence when Martha Brennan heard the news. She simply nodded slowly, as if a part of her had always known this time would arrive without crying or screaming. She requested that the bones be brought home to allow her to properly bury her children in a dignified manner. Morrison concurred, but clarified that he would have to retain some pieces as proof in the current case. Exactly 1 year after the first disappearance, on a gloomy October morning in 1862, the funeral was held. Martha insisted on a complete casket, despite the fact that little bones had been found. She filled the empty space with personal belongings, clothing that had belonged to Thomas and William, and wild flowers collected from the mountains they adored. The little wooden church reverberated with the local pastor's words of heavenly kindness and incomprehensible mysteries during a straightforward service. The mood of the Smoky Mountains underwent a sad metamorphosis in the months after the funeral. What many had already believed was verified when the corpses were found. The Brennan brothers had suffered a horrible fate, and the perpetrators were still at large on the same trails where the atrocity had been carried out. This knowledge made people feel vulnerable. Locals, particularly those who had to go in small groups or alone. The mountains, which were always intimidating and occasionally menacing, now appeared to conceal even darker secrets in their foggy caverns. Sheriff Morrison stepped up his observation of Rufus Crane and the men who often went with him. One of them was a short, stocky man named Luther Hayes, who always wore a dark hat with a large brim. It was too unsettling to be a coincidence that the description fit Sarah Whitmore's. Hayes's past included minor offenses, mostly intoxication and fights in bars, but nothing that indicated a potential for murder. But Morrison had discovered over the years that in certain situations, regular men might do exceptional acts of violence. A source who preferred to remain unidentified provided Morrison with information in November of 1862. After a few shots of whiskey, when their tongues were dangerously loose, this person said they heard Crane and Hayes conversing in a tavern. The disjointed dialogue contained allusions to the previous October's events, hazy references to horses and carts, and a story of a trade gone wrong in the mountains. Although the informant was unable to confirm that they were discussing the Brennan brothers explicitly, the temporal setting and oblique allusions were intriguing. Morrison was aware that third-party testimony from tavern chats would not be very credible in court. He required more substantive proof that would unquestionably connect Crane and Hayes to the criminal activity. In October 1861, he started looking into the two men's activities by secretly interviewing everyone who might have had contact with them at the time. An intriguing discovery was made during this process. By the end of that month, both men had been absent from their regular operating areas for about a week, and they had only returned in early November. When asked separately about this time, Hayes stated he had traveled to Knox County to see a sick relative, while Crane claimed to have been hunting in the more isolated areas of the mountains. Neither could offer trustworthy witnesses to support their claims. Even though he still lacked the definitive evidence he sought, Morrison meticulously documented these discrepancies, gradually creating a pattern of suspicious behavior. Tennessee remained a battlefield as the war progressed. Union and Confederate forces engaged in multiple engagements throughout the state during the winter of 1862 to 1863, laying a path of devastation and uprooting entire populations. Numerous Smoky Mountain men were compelled to pick a side or become deserters and run into the woods. From organized robbery to personal grudges masquerading as political allegiance, this instability served as a cover for a wide range of illicit activities. In the midst of this chaos, Morrison got a surprise letter from a Knoxville-based Union military officer. The police described a man who was apprehended while attempting to sell 2 horses to a local businessman. Military authorities were alerted to a questionable aspect of the deal, especially the fact that the seller was unable to provide a sufficient explanation for how he obtained the animals. When questioned, the man acknowledged that he had bought them from Rufus Crane months before, but he was unable to pinpoint the exact date. The horses fit the description of those that had belonged to the Brennan brothers. Morrison made the challenging trip over damaged roads to Knoxville right away. Jacob Turner, a middle-aged merchant with a questionable reputation but no past criminal convictions, was the man who was apprehended. As soon as Morrison, Turner acknowledged that he had bought 2 horses from Crane in November 1861 when he was challenged with particular information regarding the Brennans' horses. Crane had asked that the deal stay discreet, citing problems with unpaid taxes, and the price had been strangely low. Turner described the markings and traits of the horse, which remarkably matched Samuel Brennan's descriptions. One of the horses had a characteristic white patch on its forehead that resembled a crescent. The other had an outdated scar from an injury sustained years ago on its left rear leg. Turner claimed he was unaware of these particular markings when he bought the horses, despite the fact that they had been mentioned in the circulars Morrison had sent out months previously. Morrison had been looking for this concrete link for more than a year. Within weeks of the Brennan brothers' disappearance, Crane had sold horses that precisely matched those taken from them. Morrison now had a legitimate reason to arrest Hayes and Crane so they can be formally questioned. Knowing he had one chance, he planned his strategy carefully. If he made a mistake and the suspects got away, they might vanish into the mountains or the chaos of battle, making it hard to find them. Morrison gathered a few reliable men in February 1863 and got ready to take Rufus Crane into custody. They found Crane apparently running an illicit still in a remote cottage. Crane and the mountains were still covered in fog at daybreak when the approach was made. Would probably be unprepared. Silently encircling the cabin, Morrison and his crew blocked off all possible escape routes. A tense quiet followed Morrison's announcement of his presence and his plan to arrest Crane. Then, without warning, Crane came out of the cabin with his hands out in surrender. His expression was one of resignation, as though he knew that this day would eventually arrive. While other group members looked for Luther, Morrison handcuffed him and escorted him back to the Sevier County Jail. Hayes. 2 days later, Hayes was discovered in a tavern in Gatlinburg, seemingly oblivious about Crane's arrest. Hayes tried to run away when Morrison confronted him, but he was soon stopped. Hayes, in contrast to Crane, was clearly in a panic, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. To keep them from coordinating their accounts, he was also arrested and put in a different cell from Crane. Morrison started interrogating Hayes right away, thinking he would be more prone to fracture when under stress. Morrison interrogated Hayes for hours about his activities in October 1861, his connection to Crane, and the horses that were sold to Jacob Turner. Hayes first denied everything, but when Morrison showed him every bit of information and every inconsistency in his account, Hayes' denial started to fall apart. Hayes eventually acknowledged that he had been with Crane in late October of that year during the 3rd hour of interrogation, but he maintained that they had not committed any crimes. They claimed to have discovered the wagon left on the trail, the horses meandering aimlessly, and just seized what seemed to be unowned property. Hayes amended his tale once more, saying they were terrified of being falsely implicated. But Morrison pointed out that this didn't explain why they concealed the wagon in a distant ravine, or why they sold the horses covertly weeks later. With every inquiry Morrison asked, Hayes's narrative fell apart. With decades of experience questioning people, the sheriff knew precisely when someone was lying and knew how to put pressure on a weak story's weak points. Before coming back with a fresh strategy, he left Hayes alone in his cell for a few hours, letting uncertainty and anxiety seep into the man's thoughts. Morrison took Samuel Brennan into the jail so the young guy could see Hayes through the bars of his cell. With his eyes full of the sorrow and loss his family had experienced, Samuel remained silent. The quiet, no amount of verbal interrogation could match the psychological pressure caused by the presence of the deceased men's surviving sibling. Hayes averted his gaze, unwilling to maintain eye contact with Samuel. Following Samuel's departure, Morrison focused on Crane, who had maintained a wonderfully composed demeanor throughout his 2-day detention. As a more seasoned criminal than Hayes, Crane was aware that he could be executed if he admitted anything. His narrative remained straightforward and coherent. He had bought the horses from an unidentified, going through the region, paying a reasonable fee, and not inquiring as to where they came from. Crane said he had no knowledge of the wagon that was concealed in the ravine. In her evidence, Morrison recounted Sarah Whitmore's account of seeing 3 men pulling a cart on that fateful October afternoon. With a chilly smirk, Crane indicated that a lonely woman's memory was probably untrustworthy after all this time, and that she might be confusing people or dates. He wondered why Sarah had held off on coming forward for months, assuming she actually possessed pertinent information. Morrison was aware that any defense lawyer would raise these legitimate points in court. It was a frustrating legal matter. Morrison had a lot of circumstantial proof. The concealed wagon, the horses that Crane sold that matched those of the Brennan, Sarah's testimony regarding 3 suspects, and Hayes's fabrications regarding his travels, but he lacked a confession, eyewitness accounts of the crime, and tangible evidence that directly linked the suspects in the remains discovered many months later. Given these gaps, a cautious prosecutor could be reluctant to proceed with the case to trial. Once more, outside circumstances disrupted the inquiry while Morrison considered his next course of action. In March 1863, a Confederate military force took over a portion of Sevier County, seizing control of the local resources and taking charge of inmates incarcerated for significant offenses. After examining the Crane and Hayes instances, the Confederate commander, a colonel by the name of Patterson, concluded that both men would be freed on the condition that they immediately enlist in the Confederate Army due to the lack of solid proof and the need for labor for the war effort. Morrison fiercely objected to this decision, claiming that he was on the verge of getting confessions, and that letting the suspects go would endanger the investigation as a whole. But his concerns were disregarded. In Confederate territory, Patterson's military authority superseded civilian authority, and he didn't think it was worth holding 2 powerful men in a cage while they might be engaged in combat. In April 1863, Hayes and Crane were freed and joined a military unit that left for East Tennessee a few days later. Martha and Samuel Brennan were devastated by the news. They saw everything fall apart under the pressures of war after they finally saw progress in the case and found out that the likely offenders were in custody. When Morrison told Martha, she didn't say anything, but Samuel responded angrily, wondering what type of justice permitted killers to go free while their premature graves held the victims. Morrison was unable to reassure the young man. The ensuing months were spent waiting in frustration, in the hopes that he could eventually resume questioning Crane and Hayes, or that one of them, separated from the other and confronted with the atrocities of war, would choose to confess to calm his conscience. Morrison tried to locate them via military channels. He wrote multiple letters to Confederate leaders outlining the case's circumstances and asking for access to the suspects. Due to the administrative disarray of a war-torn army, the majority of his letters went unanswered. Through military channels, Morrison received surprising news in August of 1863. Luther Hayes was killed by Union artillery fire during a combat close to Chattanooga. Along with other Confederate troops slain in the same conflict, his body was interred in a mass grave. With Hayes went any hope that he would finally confess. With a sense of wasted opportunity, Morrison noted this information in his files. Hayes had arrived so. It was on the verge of collapse during that last interrogation. Despite surviving the war, Rufus Crane vanished entirely when hostilities ended in 1865. Crane appeared to have disappeared, despite Morrison's attempts to find him using military demobilization records. Some claimed he had traveled west to areas beyond the Mississippi, where people could change their names and histories. Some muttered that Crane had died as a result of a personal grudge held by a person he had met during the conflict. Not having a body, or Morrison was unable to definitively close the case despite official confirmation. The Smoky Mountains were forever altered by the war years. Many families had lost siblings, husbands, and sons in far-off conflicts. People were forced to abandon properties their family had cultivated for generations due to the economic catastrophe, which left entire villages penniless. The Brennan boys' situation turned into just another tragedy in a sea of pain in this setting of widespread loss. Despite living until 1872, Martha Brennan never fully recovered from the loss of William and Thomas. Her neighbors talked about how she had aged too quickly and how she would stay on her porch for extended periods of time, staring at the mountains as though she still hoped to see her kids coming back along the way. She kept the few items she had recovered from her children in a special trunk in her room and visited them frequently as if they were holy artifacts, but she hardly ever discussed their departure. After his mother passed away, Samuel sold the family farm and relocated to Knoxville, unable to continue operating it. To stay in a place that is plagued by so many unpleasant memories. He finally got married and had kids of his own, but many who knew him claimed that he always had a shadow of grief in his eyes. Samuel rarely talked about his missing siblings, but when he did, it was with the same unadulterated anguish as though their departure had just occurred. After decades of service, Sheriff Morrison retired in 1870. The only notable setback of his career was still the Brennan brothers case, the sole significant. He was never able to find a satisfactory solution to the probe. Morrison revealed his belief that Rufus Crane and Luther Hayes had killed Thomas and William Brennan, most likely during an attempted robbery that became violent, in his last notes on the case, which he wrote just before leaving office. But in the middle of the Smoky Mountains, the complete truth would remain permanently hidden in the absence of a confession or solid proof. The Smoky Mountains region saw significant transformation in the years after the Civil War. Social structures changed as a result of Reconstruction. Previously remote settlements were connected by new highways, and the expansion of cities like Knoxville and Chattanooga started drawing residents from the countryside who were looking for work. However, in the isolated cottages and tiny settlements strewn across the mountains, the memory of the past endured with an odd persistence passed down via tales shared around fireplaces on chilly evenings. Local mythology incorporated the Brennan brothers case, a warning about the perils of remote paths and the dark mysteries that might lurk deep in the mountains. Children heard the story from their parents, who always emphasized the value of going in groups and being cautious around strangers. Like all oral histories, certain details started to fade or change with time, but the sinister core persisted. On a typical morning, 2 young guys left and never came back. Their lives were cut short for unknown reasons. 1878 saw in Nashville. Edmund Clark, a journalist, traveled to the Smoky Mountains to investigate local history for a series of pieces about unsolved homicides in Tennessee. After hearing about the Brennan case, Clark made the decision to look into it more. He spent 3 weeks in the neighborhood, speaking with long-standing locals, looking through old newspaper archives, and attempting to find anyone who had either known the Brennan family or taken part in the initial searches. Clark was able to speak with a few witnesses who were still residing in the region. After telling Sheriff Morrison the same story 16 years prior, Sarah Whitmore, now in her 60s and in poor condition, recounted it. She maintained that she could still clearly recall seeing 3 men with the cart that day, and that their actions had greatly troubled her. Sarah claimed that she lived alone and isolated, and was terrified of reprisals if the guys found out she had been watching them when Clark questioned why she had taken so long to come forward. Another crucial. Benjamin Walsh, the hunter who found the wagon wreckage in 1862, was the interviewee. Now in his early 40s, Walsh told Clark about the scene he had seen in that isolated gully. He underlined how clear it was that the wagon had been purposefully disguised by someone, who had covered it with branches and other plants in a way that took a lot of time and effort. Walsh surmised that the perpetrators had planned to come back later to sell the lumber and fully disassemble the wagon, but something had kept them from finishing the task. Jacob Turner, the guy who had bought the horses from Rufus Crane, was also found by Clark. Turner continued to run a small animal feed company out of Knoxville. He explained to Clark how the cheap price and Crane's insistence on secrecy had made him dubious of the arrangement from the beginning. Turner acknowledged that he should have reported the purchase to the authorities right away, but he was having financial difficulties at the time and the chance to buy high-quality horses at. A discounted price had been too alluring to turn down. The matter received fresh attention after Clark's piece appeared in the Nashville Tennessean in September 1878. From the first disappearance to Morrison's unsuccessful investigation due to the war's involvement and Rufus Crane's following disappearance, the entire story was reconstructed. Clark's article ended with a somber analysis of how victims of crimes perpetrated in isolated locations where witnesses were limited, and evidence might be readily concealed or destroyed. Unexpected correspondence resulted from the publishing of the piece. A man from Arkansas claimed to know Rufus Crane's location in a letter to the press. This report claims that Crane had relocated to Van Buren, a tiny town in Crawford County, Arkansas, under a different name but fitting the physical description. Authorities in Sevier County received a dismal response after Clark relayed this information to them. The new sheriff, who assumed responsibility following. Morrison's retirement clarified that there was no legal foundation for formal charges or extradition in the absence of tangible proof or witnesses prepared to fly to Arkansas for identification. The sheriff also noted that it had been 17 years since the crime. Recollections were no longer as trustworthy. Crucial records had been lost during the turbulent war years, and important witnesses like Luther Hayes had died. Even if Crane were found and returned to Tennessee, it would be very difficult to establish a strong criminal case. Challenging. There were practical deadlines for justice, after which it was pointless to pursue cold cases. Clark was irritated by this remark since he thought that severe offenses shouldn't have a deadline. He thought about going to Arkansas himself to look into it, but he was unable to do so due to financial limitations and work obligations in Nashville. Another fascinating hint in a case full of unanswered questions was Crane's purported whereabouts, which remained unconfirmed. The Smoky Mountains started drawing tourists in the 1880s. A different kind of interest. Scientists and naturalists from Eastern institutions recorded thousands of plant and animal species after discovering the region's remarkable biodiversity. Some of these guests were captivated by the story's enduring presence in the public consciousness after hearing local accounts of the Brennan case. Locals spoke about the missing brothers with almost holy veneration, as if their disrupted lives had become part of the environment itself, according to a journal entry by a botanist from Massachusetts. There had a bad reputation for the ravine where the wagon was discovered. Even though it was a longer trip, the locals started avoiding it and found other ways to hunt and gather. On windless nights, several people reported hearing weird voices in the region, and others described feeling as though they were being watched. These stories, which were probably the result of the tragic tale, helped turn the location into a kind of unofficial shrine to Thomas and Brennan William. At the age of 58, Samuel Brennan passed away in 1893. He included a tiny amount in his bequest for the maintenance of the grave where his brother's recovered shards had been interred. He also left a journal that he had kept intermittently over the years, in which he recorded his thoughts on Thomas and William's deaths. Eventually, a local historian acquired this diary and saved it as a record of 19th-century life in the Smoky Mountains. The journal entries documented Samuel's ongoing suffering, all the way through his adult life. He described having frequent dreams in which he saw his brothers calling to him from the hazy depths of the mountains, but they were always out of reach, regardless of how quickly he ran in their direction. Samuel also documented how angry he was at the war for disrupting the investigation at a critical point, how frustrated he was with the legal system for letting suspects get away with it, and how he kept asking himself if there was anything more he could have done to keep his brothers safe or to guarantee their. The murderers were apprehended. The Smoky Mountains saw much more significant alterations in the early 20th century. Large-scale operations were started by the logging industry, which cleared enormous tracts of virgin forest that had been untouched for millennia. The massive logs of old trees were transported by railroads, and worker camps appeared in areas that were previously only reachable by little trails. The Brennan brothers' familiar terrain was permanently changed by this industrial revolution, eliminating any tangible remnants of an earlier time period. In 1907, when forestry operations were expanding, a macabre was discovered by workers constructing an access road in a distant area. They discovered human bones buried shallowly about 3 feet below the surface while excavating a slope covered in thick vegetation. The operation supervisor alerted the local police right once, and based on the state of decomposition and preliminary research, it was concluded that the remains belonged to at least one adult person buried some decades previously. The state of the bones. After looking over the remains, the county medical examiner noticed something unsettling. Several ribs and the left scapula had noticeable marks that indicated blunt force trauma, possibly from a knife or other similar instrument. These marks suggested that the victim had been severely assaulted. The bones were located in the general vicinity of the ravine where the Brennans' wagon had been discovered decades previously, but about 5 miles away. The brothers had vanished. As soon as word of the discovery went around the neighborhood, senior citizens connected it to the Brennan case. After looking through historical documents, the present sheriff, Robert Hriss, who had no personal involvement in the events of 1861, came to the conclusion that there was a plausible chance the bones belonged to either Thomas or William Brennan. Unfortunately, there were very few forensic identification techniques available at the time, without comprehensive dental records or other recorded. Identifying traits, it was unable to definitively determine identity. In an attempt to locate further remains or personal objects that would help with identification, Hendricks authorized a thorough search of the vicinity of the finding site. Workers and volunteers carefully scoured the ground for 3 days. Additional bone fragments that were dispersed across the area were discovered by them. They were compatible with the body that had been partially disturbed over time by wild animals. They also found rusty metal and bits of rotted fabric, buttons and pieces of what might have been a belt made of leather. One of the buttons featured a unique design that was typical of 1860s men's work clothes. Although it didn't offer concrete evidence, this chronological element bolstered the hypothesis that the remains might belong to one of the Brennan brothers. Hriss sought advice from those who had known the Brennan family. However, only a small number of people were still alive after more than 40 years, and nobody could remember particular information like buttons or clothing that could prove identity. The community's long-standing wounds were reignited by the finding. The results were shared with Samuel's grandchildren and other Brennan family descendants. They went to the location and asked that the remains be interred with the pieces that had been found decades ago in the family tomb. Even though positive identification was still unattainable, Hicks consented, enabling another group of the missing siblings to at last have a dignified funeral. Hicks made a discovery when looking through the old files that had been forgotten or forgotten over time. He discovered a letter from Sheriff Morrison in 1870, just before he retired, among the original case files. Morrison presented material that had never been made public in this letter to his successor, outlining his last suspicions regarding the case. Morrison claims that in 1869 he received an anonymous letter purportedly from a person who knew Rufus Crane intimately. According to the anonymous letter, Crane admitted to the crime while under the influence of alcohol. Years following the incidents. This story claims that Thomas Brennan resisted, attempting to protect his property and his brother, when Crane and two other men stopped the Brennan brothers on the trail with the sole intention of stealing their belongings and horses. Both brothers died as a result of the dramatic escalation of the incident. The bandits then concealed the wagon, sold the horses covertly, and hid the bodies in different places in the highlands. Morrison was never able to confirm this letter's legitimacy, or determine who wrote it. The anonymous informant's name was not discovered through further research, and the handwriting did not match anyone he knew. Morrison thought it might have been the third individual Sarah Whitmore had named, a man who had been involved in the crime but had suffered from guilt for years. However, the letter remained merely another fascinating piece of an unsolved mystery in the absence of further details. With this fresh evidence, Chris contemplated formally reopening the probe, and the recently found bones, but legal counsel clarified that about 50 years had gone by. Important witnesses had passed away. Although his fate was never verified, Rufus Crane was most likely dead, and the anonymous letter had no legal significance without confirmation. It would be unfeasible and probably pointless to prosecute such an old case. Hicks's best course of action was to meticulously record every new finding and include it in the permanent case file. The dispute about protecting the Smoky Mountains intensified in the 1910s. The unique environment was being destroyed by logging operations, according to conservationists, and steps had to be made to save what was left of the old-growth forests. Decades later, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park was established as a result of these talks. However, there was a fierce argument during that early time between proponents of preservation and others who believed that resource extraction had economic benefits. Interestingly, there were sporadic references to the Brennan brothers' case in these discussions. In addition to significant biodiversity, preservationists contended that the mountains held a wealth of human history, including recollections of tragedies like as the disappearance of the Brennan. They proposed that making the region a national park would help keep these tales alive for future generations and stop modernization from erasing them entirely. In his 1923 book, Mysteries of the Appalachian Mountains, real crime author Harold Mitchell devoted a whole chapter to the case of Brennan brothers. Mitchell had done a great deal of research, speaking with Sheriff Hicks, looking through newspaper records and interviewing family members. Although he admitted that important details of the case will never be understood, his narrative was the most thorough and well-documented to date. Mitchell's book attracted a sizable readership and rekindled interest in the case across the country. Some individuals claimed to have further information in their letters to the author. However, the majority of these assertions turned out to be untrue or based on hearsay. An old woman in Missouri wrote a particularly interesting letter claiming that her late father had known Rufus Crane in his later years. This woman claimed that Crane had resided in Missouri under a false identity until his death in 1918, keeping his secrets to himself and never coming clean about his wrongdoings. The Missouri woman's letter was intriguing due to the abundance of detailed data as well as its content. It supplied. She explained that her father had been a merchant in a little town called Springfield and had known a man who called himself Robert Carlson, but whose physical attributes and demeanor exactly matched the historical accounts of Rufus Crane. This man avoided protracted social encounters, lived in seclusion on the outskirts of town, and occasionally made mysterious remarks about a past in Tennessee he would rather forget. According to the woman, during the last. Throughout Carlson's life, there were indications of severe psychological suffering. In times of vulnerability, Carlson talked about judgments he had made decades previously that plagued him, drank excessively, and experienced nightmares that caused him to scream at night. He never admitted to any particular crime outright, but his hazy allusions to terrible incidents in the Tennessee highlands implied that he was intimately aware of something sinister. Harold Mitchell made an effort to confirm these assertions by Missouri Public Records. He learned that a man by the name of Robert Carlson had indeed resided in Springfield, had away in 1918, and was interred in a nearby cemetery. Mitchell even went to Missouri to see the tomb, which had a plain gravestone with minimal information about the person buried there. There were no records or known photos of Carlson that Mitchell could use to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was, in fact, Rufus Crane living under false pretenses. This ambiguity was a superb example of the annoying, the Brennan case's nature. All of the potential leads ended in dead ends. Every potential response led to further inquiries. Decades and the deaths of everyone who had first-hand knowledge of the events always made the truth appear just out of grasp. Mitchell's book ended with a contemplation of how certain mysteries are unsolvable and endure as an enduring feature of a region's past. As the Great Smoky Mountains National Park concept developed in the 1930s, historians started methodically, recording the tales of families who had spent generations living in the highlands. When the park was created, many of these families would have to abandon their ancestral homesteads, and it was acknowledged that their tales needed to be told before they were lost forever. This documentary featured the Brennan brothers' case as a noteworthy illustration of the perilous and unpredictable alpine life of the 19th century. The Oral History Project interviewers had conversations with very old people who, as children, had personally witnessed the vanishing of the Brennan. A 92-year-old woman remembered her grandmother telling her about Martha Brennan, a ghostly figure in black who became a symbol of unfathomable loss, who would wander the foggy paths in search of her missing children. Another respondent related tales of how the case had made mountain travelers more cautious and suspicious of strangers. These conversations demonstrated how the case had a significant impact on the general awareness of the area. Not only was it a personal tragedy for the Brennan family, but it also altered social norms and served as a warning to future generations. Youngsters in the Smoky Mountains learned early on that the mountains were both lovely and perilous, providing both food and hidden dangers, thanks to stories they heard about Thomas and William. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park was first established in 1934, brought about significant changes in the area. Numerous families were relocated. Trails were designated for recreational usage, and old cabins were either removed or saved as historic specimens. Many of the locations where searches had been carried out decades earlier, including the gully where the Brennan wagon was discovered, were inside the new park's limits. The Brennan brothers' story, which was handed down among park rangers as part of local legend, finally became familiar to them. Strange encounters in some remote locations were described by some. Sections of the park, inexplicable feelings of sadness, or an unseen presence. The experiences helped preserve Thomas and William's memories even as the physical world around them changed irrevocably, despite their logical explanations of suggestibility and past knowledge of the terrible tale. David Thornton, a cultural anthropologist, studied in great detail how rural communities communicate and keep memories of unsolved crimes in the 1950s. The Brennan was his choice. One of his main case studies is the brothers case. Thornton interviewed dozens of locals, from grandchildren of the Brennan family to locals with no familial ties to the events, since he was fascinated by the story's enduring power and the shared memory despite the lack of a suitable conclusion. Thornton found intriguing trends in the story's development over the years. A few things stayed amazingly constant: the brothers' names, the disappearance date, and the knowledge that they were never completely located. However, oral transmission has changed other elements. Some storytellers included dramatic details, such phantom encounters in the mountains years later, or supernatural omens before to the disappearance, that are not present in contemporary documents. Thornton maintained that these changes did not lessen the story's significance as a cultural relic. Instead, they illustrated how communities absorb collective pain and pass along significant values through the use of historical narratives. The narrative of the Brennan brothers taught lessons about prudence, the brittleness of justice in distant areas, and the potential for violence to ruin families and create wounds that would never completely heal. Regardless of how accurate any particular detail was, these lessons were still applicable. A memorial piece reviewing the case was published in the Knoxville newspaper in 1961, precisely 100 years after the initial abduction. The reporter visited important locations inside the country, examined all accessible archives, and spoke with local historians. Park. Photographs of the location where the wagon was discovered, which is now heavily forested and almost identifiable from its state a century ago, were featured in the piece. Everyone who had a direct personal link to the events had died decades ago, the report lamented. In 1943, the last known individual to have had a genuine acquaintance with Thomas and William Brennan passed away. The narrative now belongs solely to the domain of recorded history and cultural memory that was cut off from actual experience. This change was. It was unavoidable, but when the final individual who had known the brothers died, it felt like they were dying again. Interesting correspondence was produced by the anniversary piece. According to a letter from an old man in Asheville, North Carolina, his family had known Luther Hayes before to the war and had always thought that Hayes had a horrible secret. In the months before his forced military service, this man's grandfather had characterized Hayes as a tortured man, someone who spoke cryptically about irreversible faults and drank excessively. Long-standing suspicions regarding Hayes's involvement were further supported by this material, even if it did not significantly alter what was already known about the case. If they had been available in 1861, the remarkable advancements in forensic science that occurred in the last decades of the 20th century would have completely changed the way the Brennan brothers case was investigated. Computerized facial reconstruction, carbon dating, DNA analysis, and numerous other methods fundamentally changed how historical crimes may be looked into. On occasion, historians and fans of unsolved mysteries have conjectured about what would be found if the remains ascribed to the Brennan brothers were examined using contemporary methods. This